Selamat petang dan salam sejahtera. A very good afternoon to everyone here today. I'm Harvinder Kaur, your Master of Ceremony for today's event, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. I would humbly request that you allow me to conduct today's event in English. On behalf of the Faculty of Medicine, University Malaya, I would like to thank you for attending this inaugural lecture by Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. Jamal I-Ching from the Department of Medical Microbiology, Faculty of Medicine, and University of Malaya Medical Center. Everybody, please rise. Announcing the arrival of Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. April Camelia Roslani, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, who will be chairing the lecture, and the arrival of Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. Jamal I-Ching Department of Medical Microbiology, Faculty of Medicine, University of Malaya. Please be seated. Distinguished guests, professors, academicians, healthcare workers, students, ladies and gentlemen, those present here and online, good afternoon and salam sejahtera to everyone. I'm Harvinder Kaur, your Master of Ceremony for today. On behalf of the Faculty of Medicine, University of Malaya, I would like to thank you for attending this inaugural lecture by Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. Jamal I-Ching from the Department of Medical Microbiology, Faculty of Medicine, and University Malaya Medical Center. The title of this lecture is Learning from Outbreaks. An inaugural lecture is undertaken by an academic to commemorate their promotion to professor. It is an opportunity to present their achievements and reflections on their career and field of work, not only to the university and hospitals, their colleagues, but to the public at large. I would like now to invite Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. Camilla Roslani to chair the lecture and introduce Professor Dr. Jamal. Please welcome Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. April Camilla Roslani.
Thank you very much, Puan Harvinder Kaur. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, and good afternoon to everyone. It gives me great pleasure to chair this inaugural lecture by Professor Dr. Jamal I-Ching Sam, who is a professor at the Department of Medical Microbiology, Faculty of Medicine, University of Malaya, and also consultant medical microbiologist at the University Malaya Medical Center. It was the ever-evolving nature of medical microbiology that drew the young Dr. Jamal to the field. From responding to resurgence of diseases thought consigned to history, to battling new outbreaks and anticipating future challenges, microbiologists are the unsung superheroes of infection control. Indeed, there is a saying that one should always trust a microbiologist because they have the best chance of predicting when the world will end. Professor Jamal has battled many such outbreaks, including chikungunya, the pandemic influenza H1N1, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, Ebola, Zika, and of course, who can forget, SARS-CoV-2. It was Louis Pasteur who said that without laboratories, people of science are like soldiers without arms, and indeed, the UMMC COVID-19 task force would not have been able to effectively manage the demands of the pandemic without the steadying guidance and support from Professor Jamal and his team. Professor Jamal graduated from the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom in 1995 and obtained his MRCP in 1998. He completed postgraduate training in medical microbiology in South London, attaining the MRC path in 2004. He returned to Malaysia after 19 years in the UK and joined University of Malaya as an associate professor in 2005. Professor Jamal is involved in teaching clinical microbiology and research with an interest in medical virology. As a teacher, he has been particularly involved in the Master of Pathology program and helps to train new generations of medical microbiologists. As a clinical microbiologist, he has headed the Diagnostic Virology Unit for most of his career, and since 2007 has also headed the Advanced Molecular Diagnostics Unit in the Diagnostic Microbiology Laboratory. This laboratory serves the patients of University Malaya Medical Center, a 1,000-bed tertiary referral center in Kuala Lumpur. His research interests cover clinical, epidemiological, diagnostic, and pathogenesis aspects of chikungunya virus, enterovirus 71, and respiratory viruses, including influenza. He was promoted to professor in 2012 and previously served as head of department from 2010 to 2011 and 2014 to 2016. He has been head of department at UMMC since 2018. His lecture today is entitled Learning from Outbreaks, and we look forward to hearing him describe his career and achievements in medical microbiology and why he continues to find this a fascinating, ever-evolving, and challenging field. Please join me in welcoming Prof. Jamal to deliver his address.
Thank you very much, Professor April and Harvinder, for your kind introductions. And thank you very much to everybody who's listening out there this afternoon. So I intend over the next 35 to 40 minutes to give you a flavor of what I've done in my career, the experiences I've had and what I've learnt. And also for those of you who are not aware of medical microbiology, which remains until now one of the relatively less publicized fields in medicine, I hope to give you an idea of what exactly it is that we do. So I'll start off with a little outline of what my career in infection has been so far. When I first started off thinking what I wanted to be, in fact, because I liked writing and reading very much, I initially wanted to be a writer or a journalist or even a filmmaker. After that, I thought I wanted to be a zoologist, but I guess like many good Asian students, I ended up doing medicine. And I went to the University of Nottingham, where I graduated in 1995. So Nottingham is in the East Midlands of England, in the United Kingdom. And here you can see a picture of myself and Juanita, who now is my wife, but was also a student in the same year, and my mother. So after Nottingham, where I actually initially found that medical microbiology was my favorite subject, and I enjoyed very much reading about organisms, and I found it really easy to learn the Latin names for bacteria, which others didn't. But after I graduated, and I went to Perdana Hospital in Kandy, Sri Lanka for my elective, where I was warmly welcomed by many of the medical students there who were extremely friendly and interested in showing me around. And they were quite an amazing bunch. A lot of them had their medical careers delayed for several years because there had been an insurrection a few years before that. But they were all very enthusiastic and optimistic people, and I learned a lot from them. And also this was my first taste of tropical medicine and infectious diseases, which included seeing patients with snake bites and rabies as well, tragically. So after being in Perdana, I took my first medical job as a houseman in Stafford, which is a small hospital in the West Midlands of England. And it was here that I understood, I guess, for the first time, the teamwork required to work in medicine. So this is a group of 5 of us. We were the medical housemen in Stafford, and we got on extremely well. We did most things together. We didn't go anywhere on the weekends because we were just stuck there. But that camaraderie that we had, I think, is something which the further on you get in medicine, you kind of lose a little bit because you don't have to do late night on calls and things anymore. But it's certainly something that I look back on with a great deal of fondness. So at this point, I was pretty interested in doing infectious diseases as a career, and I therefore joined a medical rotation in Derby, which was quite close to where Nottingham was, and this was for 18 months. And this was also where I had my first ever publication, which was just a small picture and case history in the British Medical Journal. And this was a small thing, but for someone who enjoyed writing and publishing, this was the first time I'd been published, and I got a big thrill out of it, which is something which I still get today. In those days, of course, we used to get our papers, we used to get hard copies of our papers in journals, and that really added to it. Nowadays, you just get PDFs, but nevertheless, this was quite an important time for me to learn to start writing and enjoy writing and doing some reading. I was then lucky to get a infectious diseases job in Liverpool, in a hospital which is now known as University Hospital Aintree, under the consultants Fred Nye and Nick Beeching. And again, I felt a bit lucky to get this job because the other senior house officer who got the second job was very experienced and had spent several years in South Africa running a TB program. So I was quite a junior, a baby in comparison. But nevertheless, this was a really highly enjoyable job, very intense and busy. But the team were incredibly enthusiastic about infectious diseases, and every patient was just exciting, even though it was just another gastroenteritis. And Fred and Nick were extremely encouraging to their juniors, and they encouraged me very much to write a case series on HIV. And again, this is a relatively small thing now, but at the time it was quite a big thrill for me. And I think that encouragement that they gave me as seniors to publish and to do research is something that I've carried on to where I am now, and I certainly really encourage my juniors to do this. At this point, I felt that I was also interested in laboratory microbiology, so I took a one-year job in Stafford in medical microbiology. And again, I was fortunate to get this job because it's not, you don't get many of these posts in the UK. And what this job gave me the luxury of doing for 6 months was to spend that whole time on the benches as acting as a medical laboratory technologist and really getting my hands dirty, so to speak, and to really understand and get a feel for bacteria and fungi. So this is very rare. There are not many people who can get opportunity to do this, and I certainly learned a lot here under David Waghorn and Mary Lyons, who were my consultants then. And after this, I decided to commit to medical microbiology, and I got a 5-year rotation training in medical microbiology in South London, which was mainly based in King's College Hospital, as well as Dulwich and Greenwich hospitals. And this picture shows me at my last journal club with some of my consultants, including Jim Wade, Ian Eltringham, John Philpott Howard, and Mark Zuckerman. And I learned a lot about medical microbiology, clinical medical microbiology, with them in a very busy teaching hospital, which was also a referral center for things like liver failure and so on. Sort of hiding in the picture on the left there is Mel Smith, who was a clinical scientist that I did my research project under, and that was my first introduction and hands-on to PCR and molecular testing, so I owe a lot to him as well. So in 2004, I also got my membership with the Royal College of Pathologists, but unfortunately this blurred photo is all I have to prove I was there. But with that, by this point, I was married and had a 1-year-old son, and we felt that it was time to return to Malaysia, where our families were and where it was warmer. So we switched this, which is our view from our flat in London, for the more lush surroundings of PJ, and this is where we ended up. And I managed to get a job at University Malaya here when Professor Hamimah Hassan was the head of department, and Professor Dato Amin Jalaluddin was the dean of the faculty, and they were both incredibly encouraging and welcomed me back here and made me feel very wanted. And one of the things that I had to do, it was obviously quite a steep learning curve, starting off as a consultant, but I was put in charge of the virology diagnostic unit because there was a gap at the time, and so I really had to start learning a lot of virology because I wasn't fully formally trained in microbiology, because medical microbiology, although it encompasses virology, it's mainly focused on bacteriology. So that was a steep learning curve for me. And it was also made more challenging because of the subsequent number of outbreaks that we all had to go through. So just a quick aside about outbreaks due to emerging infectious diseases. So EIDs are infectious diseases that are either new, have never been described before, or they have been known about, but are increasing quite dramatically in incidence or spreading in terms of geographic range. And this is a very famous figure which was put together by Anthony Fauci and colleagues. It's been updated over the years, but this is the one from 2017, which shows the EIDs that have been reported around the world since the 1980s. And the diseases which are in red are newly identified diseases, and the diseases in blue are the ones which are known about but are re-emerging or resurging. And you can see that in our part of the world, which is East Asia and Southeast Asia, we've had quite a few red diseases which are newly emerging, and many of these are viruses. Okay, so this, of course, meant that the virologist in the hospital had to deal with a lot of these outbreaks. And here is a list of the key outbreaks that have happened on my watch, so to speak. So you can see that this is only since 2005, but we've had quite a few. The year after I got here, I helped to deal with a chikungunya outbreak in Bagan Panchor, which I will mention in a bit more detail later. And as well as an enterovirus 71 outbreak in Brunei. And this virus causes hand, foot and mouth disease in children, but can also cause brain infections. We were asked by the Bruneian National Laboratory to help with diagnostics, and they sent us their samples, which we tested and typed for them. So interestingly, these two viruses really became the main focus of my research over the next 15, 20 years, and they were really the two main ones that, the first ones that I encountered. A couple of years later, there was an even bigger chikungunya outbreak, which this time involved most of the country, as opposed to the first one, which was just one little village. And then in 2009, of course, there was the pandemic, which was the big one up to that point, and that was of influenza H1N1. 3 years later, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, or MERS coronavirus, appeared in Saudi Arabia, and some cases were exported to other parts of the world. In 2012 to 2014, we also started seeing a few cases of brucella. Brucella is a bacteria which is spread from cows and goats and sheep to humans who drink their milk, which has not been sufficiently pasteurized or sterilized. So we started to see a resurgence of these cases because around that time there was quite a big interest in drinking goat's milk. In 2013, there was another hand, foot and mouth disease outbreak in Malaysia, and this was mainly due to Coxsackie virus A6. And we also saw adenovirus type 7, and this is a virus that causes pneumonia in children, and I'll mention that in a little bit more in a bit. In 2015, Ebola appeared in West Africa and spread to some other countries around the world, but thankfully not to Malaysia. And then in 2015 to 16, again, Zika virus, which had been reported in Malaysia decades ago, reappeared in the Pacific and the Americas to cause very large outbreaks, and also a few cases in Malaysia. And I've managed to get all the way until this point in my talk without mentioning SARS-CoV-2, which is of course the cause of COVID-19, which has really taken over our lives in the last year or so. Okay, so I'll briefly mention a little bit about human adenovirus 7 amongst all those outbreaks. And this is a paper which was published in PLOS ONE that we did with Jessie De Bruin and Anna Marie Nathan, who are respiratory pediatric consultants from UMMC, whom we've subsequently worked with on quite a few studies, particularly of respiratory viruses. And what we found was that in 2011, 2012, if you look at this figure on the left, that the adenovirus that was causing respiratory infections in children were from different types, from 1 to 7. But in 2013, the vast majority, which is colored red, were caused by human adenovirus type 7. And this was also associated with a lot of these kids ending up in pediatric intensive care with very severe lung disease, some of whom also suffered lung disease afterwards, even when they had supposedly recovered from the acute infection. So this was one of the examples where, as a diagnostic virologist responsible for helping patients get diagnosis of the infectious diseases, we also managed to combine this work with some research to understand a little bit about the epidemiology of the disease. Okay, so I've just thrown you a whole list of outbreaks which we've had to deal with. What do we actually do? So that's one of the main crux of this talk. What does a medical microbiologist do? So as I said, we help with diagnosis of laboratory diagnosis of the disease, and therefore every time there's a new EID, we are part of the hospital outbreak committees that are formed. So every time one of these new EIDs rears its head, the hospital has to put plans in place about what to do if a patient comes in with one of these diseases. And this is a multidisciplinary team, which is usually led by infectious diseases, but includes representatives from emergency department, intensive care, pediatrics, medicine, and so on. So the job is to come together and make a plan to prepare what will need to be addressed if somebody in that with that disease or suspected of having that disease comes to our hospital. So from our point of view in the laboratory, our job is to find an appropriate diagnostic test. And this can be a little challenging sometimes because if it's a brand new organism, there will be no commercial tests available. So we have to take some of the protocols which are published for free by organizations like WHO or the Centers of Disease Control in the US. And what they do is that they publish protocols for PCR tests, molecular tests, which enable labs all around the world to buy the basic building blocks of PCR, which are pretty much available to most people, and you can put them together to come up with this diagnostic test. And this is a kind of with the internet and with PCR, it's a kind of democratization of diagnostics because it allows anyone really with basic molecular and PCR equipment to run a test without having to wait for a commercial test to become available. So this is something that we will do. We also need to ensure the biosafety of our staff, and just to give you a definition of this, biosafety is the collection of principles and practice which ensure the safety of mainly laboratory staff who are handling samples from infected patients or handling samples which may potentially contain that agent, because some of these agents can be harmful to health. So what this means in practice is that if you look at this picture here, we have to use personal protective equipment like face masks, gowns, gloves, and we use specialized equipment like this biosafety cabinet that the person is using, which protects him from exposure to the sample or to the agent. So this is an extremely important part of our laboratory. And as an example, this is a paper from the Journal of Hospital Infection, which describes an episode where our laboratory grew Brucella from a case. And this is, as I mentioned, this is a bacteria which is spread by drinking unpasteurized milk. And the danger of Brucella in the laboratory is that if you grow it in large concentrations and you do certain test procedures, you can create aerosols which can infect the laboratory staff. And at the time, we hadn't had a case of Brucella for 15 to 20 years, so it wasn't something that I guess we were very prepared for. And unfortunately, we did not use what is accepted as the appropriate biosafety measures, and many of our staff were exposed, which necessitated follow-up and giving antibiotic to prevent disease. So very fortunately, nobody came down with brucellosis. It's not a very nice disease. At least two of my family members have had it in Saudi Arabia from drinking unpasteurized camel milk. So it was good. It was a very good learning experience for us. And what it did was it led to us really strengthening our biosafety protocols. because it gave us a bit of a scare. And we put these protocols in place to prevent something like this from happening again, and also increased awareness about biosafety overall. And of course, you're kind of making it as an academic when you can take something potentially bad and turn it into a publication, which is what we did. Okay, so what else do? We put all these things together. We put a diagnostic test and all the biosafety, and we put everything together into a protocol and a workflow. And we have to make sure that we have sufficient trained staff to do the test and to do it safely. And we were very much aided by this by the fact that our molecular labs, until this point, had been expanding in capacity for many years. The molecular laboratory was led by the late Professor Peng, who was a man of great foresight and who loved new technology. So he was always looking forward and introducing molecular tests and increasing training and so on. So we had, by this point, really been building up our human resource and our training and our equipment. And with each new outbreak, we gained more and more experience to deal with the next outbreak. From a personal point of view, I was fortunate to go on 2 sabbaticals in Australia. The first in 2012, where I went to the WHO Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza in Melbourne. And this was under Dr. Ian Barr. And that's where I did a lot of hands-on experience with influenza diagnostics, including PCR and culture and serological tests. And then 5 years later, I was very, very lucky to get an Endeavour Executive Fellowship from the Government of Australia, which took me to Pathwest Laboratory in Perth under Professor David Smith. And this laboratory is the tertiary, basically the main referral centre for molecular tests for the whole of Western Australia. So they are extremely experienced. They do thousands of tests every day. And I learned a lot about running a molecular diagnostic service there. So a lot of these things that I learned in these 2 sabbaticals I brought back to our department and helped to build upon what our staff, led by Prof. Peng, had achieved. And in many ways, I guess we've been building this all up for COVID-19, which has been to date, I think, the biggest challenge that the laboratory has had in terms of molecular testing for outbreaks. And as a quick example, if you look at the graph below, from doing a PCR test for SARS-CoV-2, we had never done one before, January 2020. In the last year or so, we've done almost 50,000. And this has been made more difficult really because we only have semi-automation. In other words, most of our tests are still very manual and labor intensive. And you can see from this graph that which shows the number of tests that we do a day, that we did up to 700 a day. And the blue bars are the tests that were done for our hospital, and the red bars are the ones that we did to help Ministry of Health through a very busy time. And so this is the large group of people in our laboratory who were involved quite heavily in COVID-19 testing. And only some of them, obviously there were actually more, but this was mainly the laboratory staff, the medical laboratory technologists, and the scientists, and they were extremely professional and dedicated and really stepped up to the plate through a very busy and stressful time. This was also because UMMC was one of the first hospitals to accept COVID patients in Malaysia, and subsequently we as a laboratory had to be one of the first to be able to offer the test. So a few months after that, we published lessons from the field to share with others what our experiences were in building up this service in a developing country. This was published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. And what the author list is meant to convey is that this was very much a team effort. So apart from the people in the laboratory, the medical laboratory technologists, the scientists and the microbiologists, we also dealt very closely with the clinicians in the hospital task force, who gave a lot of very valuable and important feedback, and we had to work together to ensure that the tests fit in with clinical pathways. And then also really the unsung people in a lot of the COVID management. A lot of focus is given to the frontline workers and so on, and deservedly so. But management is also extremely important. We had a lot of invisible sort of people who work behind the scenes to help you buy the reagents, procurement, regulatory issues, raise funds, and things like that. And some of these people were, just as instrumental as the people in the laboratory, and they really gave us the opportunity to just really focus on what was needed from the hospital, which was to provide the lab test. And then, because of course we are interested in research as well, we also did some work on the samples and the viruses that we recovered. And this is a paper that we published in PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases, which includes quite a few of the medical teams. And what we managed to show was that during the second wave of the pandemic in Malaysia, which happened around April 2020, a lot of this wave was driven by a super spreader event from a religious mass gathering. And we showed that a lot of the viruses associated with this mass gathering and the second wave in Malaysia was due to this quite rare genotype of SARS-CoV-2, which is called B6. And this also we also showed that this spread to the rest of the region as well. And in fact, this lineage has more or less disappeared now. But that was one of our interesting epidemiological studies. Okay, so research has been a really important part of my career. It's really something I enjoy very much because it's creative. It satisfies my enjoyment of asking pertinent questions and reading and writing. So what I'm going to do now is just to briefly tell you about some of the research that I've done over the years, but focusing mainly on chikungunya virus, which I've also done work on enterovirus and respiratory viruses, but this has really been my main focus. So chikungunya virus is a virus which is transmitted by Aedes mosquitoes, which are the same Aedes mosquitoes that spread dengue to people. And in humans, it causes outbreaks of fever, rash, and joint pain. So you can see from this picture of a pair of hands, very swollen joints. And sometimes these joint pains can last for many months and even years later. So quite a debilitating disease. And the first time we wrote about this was in 2006 when there was an outbreak in a small fishing village in Perak State called Bagan Pancho. And we helped the Ministry of Health with diagnosing this particular outbreak, and we showed it to be due to chikungunya, but of the Asian type. And this Asian type is the one that was probably endemic or native, I guess you could say, to Asia at the time. And it was not the East African genotype, which was what was starting to cause a big worldwide outbreak at around the same time. So that was a bit unexpected, if you like, because or I think many people thought that the East African type was going to be spreading around the world, and chikungunya had not really appeared in Malaysia for many, many decades. So it was a bit surprising that when it did appear, it was actually a different type to what was expected. So that one was published in Emerging Infectious Diseases, and then a year later, I was part of a field trip that went to Bagan Pancho, and this was organized by Mas Ayu Said, who's a professor in social preventive medicine now. And she has really wonderful organizational skills and even more wonderful Mandarin speaking skills. So this was a huge benefit when we went to this village. And we brought a very large, enthusiastic team of medical students and SPM staff and students as well. And we did various things, including mapping the disease, the cases in the town, and we showed that the attack rate was very high, 56%. We showed that when chikungunya came to this village, there was a lot of susceptible people, so there was no immunity or very little immunity, and there was a very high attack rate. And we also showed that about 18% of the people who had serological evidence of the disease didn't report symptoms at the time, so quite a lot of them were asymptomatic. And so we published this in American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and it was a really interesting and fun, eye-opening field trip. A couple of years later, there was another outbreak of chikungunya, but this time it affected the whole country. So every state practically was involved, and we did a lot of tests for people from different states, and we published this in Journal of Clinical Virology, which showed that this nationwide outbreak in Malaysia was in fact now due to the East African type and had replaced the Asian type. So this was more in keeping with what was being seen around the world, East African type. And it was likely that this particular one was introduced from travelers to India. So one of the things about EIDs or doing research in EIDs is that there's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of funds available because there are new diseases and there's a lot of people affected, so it's the funders are very keen to fund this. However, one of the challenges as a researcher in a developing country, I guess you could say, is that if everybody in the world is working on this disease, it becomes a little bit more difficult to publish because you have to compete with a lot more laboratories which are better equipped and better resourced. So in a way, what's important, and a very important lesson that I learned in research here is to make sure you ask niche questions, which are still, of course, very relevant to the world, but which have particular relevance or a niche kind of samples or situation in where you are, and also to build on strengths in your university. So what we thought was that having two types of chikungunya, Asian and East African, was relatively unusual in the world at the time, and also many people were not looking at both. They were just looking at the one that was causing a problem in their country. So we started thinking about looking at both genotypes to see if there were any differences. And one of the first papers we did with this was with Dr. Wan Yusof and Dr. Indra Vitalingam, and this was the first paper that we did with these great entomologists from the Department of Parasitology, and we compared the two types of chikungunya virus with the two types of mosquitoes that were transmitting it, and we found that the East African type was better adapted in Aedes albopictus, while the Asian type was better adapted to Aedes aegypti, and that this could possibly explain why the latest chikungunya outbreak was mainly found in rural areas, because it was better adapted to Aedes albopictus. So this was an example of a kind of a niche question, but also building on our strengths, because we have very lucky in the Faculty of Medicine to have an arthropod containment laboratory, which is basically a specialized insect laboratory which allows us to infect mosquitoes with viruses, but in a safe way. And there are not many places in Malaysia which can do this safely. So this is really a huge asset that we have here in the Faculty of Medicine, and one which we really took advantage of with Dr. Wan Yusof and Dr. Indra. So we also went on with a couple of PhD students, Chiam Chun Wei and Chua Chong Long, who's still with us, to compare these two types in terms of their immune responses. And we found that they elicited different immune responses, which could affect the impact of the virus in the brains of mice, using mice as a model, and also for immune protection in humans. So this is impact for subsequent infections, and also for protection from vaccines if vaccines are made available. We also looked at different aspects of chikungunya. So together with infectious disease team, in this case, one of their MOs, medical officers, and Sharifa Said Omar and Adiba Kamaruzaman, we looked at how chikungunya and dengue, which can present in quite similar ways, we looked at the clinical and laboratory parameters that could help to distinguish them from a clinician's point of view. And then as another example of other aspects that we looked at, we worked with the Department of Wildlife, Jeffreen Rovi Ryan and Frankie Thomas Sitam, to look at whether there was evidence for chikungunya being present in long-tailed macaques, which are the monkeys, the buruk that you see running around everywhere, including in our university. And we found that unlike in Africa, where the monkey is thought to be a natural reservoir, we didn't find strong evidence for this in Malaysia. More recently, we worked with Sarat Das from Heriot-Watt University and Balvinder Singh of Ministry of Health to look at how chikungunya spread in Sarawak during the 2009-2010 outbreak. And they had over 3,500 cases. And we showed using a geographic information system study that the cases were spread mainly in rural areas and used roads and rivers to achieve that spread throughout Sarawak. So that was an interesting paper which we did in collaboration with Ministry of Health. So those are examples of research that I've done mainly in chikungunya, and what we hope that we've done is contribute to the knowledge of chikungunya epidemiology, particularly in Malaysia, with some, of course, impact to the rest of the world. So I still have a few years ahead of me, and hopefully, and still have things I want to achieve in research. And so just a few of my thoughts about research in Malaysia for the future. I think in the 15 years I've been here, the research culture in certainly, and Malaysia has really moved on in leaps and bounds. I think there's been more funding made available, been greater awareness about the importance of research, and greater support for researchers. And some of the things that I hope we will continue to build on in future are to have good administrative support for researchers, which I think is sometimes an understated part of research culture. Having flexible oversight, so obviously research needs to be regulated, but hopefully in a flexible way that also facilitates research. Personally, I also feel I would like to try and have more collaborations within Malaysia as well as outside of Malaysia, but I think this is important. And I think we should also continue to stress the quality of research rather than just quantity of papers. And something which I feel is very important is that we should be supporting our students a lot. I mean, we do support them now, but I think we can certainly build on this. I think students are really the lifeblood of research in a university. They're young, they have fresh ideas, they have a lot of energy. And there's a quote from James Watson, who said that there were many things I knew I would miss about Harvard. He said this when he was leaving Harvard University to go to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. There are many things I knew I would miss about Harvard, but by far the first would be its students. And I hope that's something that we keep reminding ourselves about. Okay, so just to kind of finish off, I would like to give tribute to and give acknowledgement to some of the people that I've worked with in my career. So to start off with, my fellow lecturers in the Department of Medical Microbiology. So the obligatory pictures of people, groups of people in restaurants. So we've had many great people pass through our department. Some have retired, some have moved on to newer pastures. So a lot of good memories with some of these people. And also in the bottom right picture there are some pictures of microbiologists from different universities, because at least once or twice a year I meet up with them to prepare examinations for Masters of Pathology. So I've got to know them over the years, and always enjoy meeting up with them. And you can see from this picture that most of the time I'm the only male in these meetings. So also would like to acknowledge the the staff of the hospital department of medical microbiology. A very dedicated bunch of people, really uncomplaining and work very hard, particularly with this recent pandemic. And unfortunately, I can't use an arrow. I can't use oh yes, I can. So I'd just also like to highlight a few people, including Ms. Hui Po Sim, who was for a long time the senior medical laboratory technologist for virology. And when I first started in virology, and as I mentioned before, I hadn't had a lot of training in virology. I really depended on her a lot for technical advice, and she really helped with a lot of the development of the virology lab over the years. She retired last year. Okay, and then in the bottom picture, I would also like to highlight the numerous medical officers and empath students who've passed through our doors. They usually spend 1 to 4 years with us, and we train them, and in return they provide us with their youthful vigor and enthusiasm, and also, of course, play a very important role in our diagnostic service. So a big shout out to them as well. And then for my research team, I've had a research laboratory which I've shared with Chan Yok Fan, who is here, okay, since about 2006. We joined at about the same time. We ended up with 2 benches, but we shared 2 benches, but we pooled our research grants, and then subsequently shared a laboratory and share most of our students and projects now. And so I'm reminded of a quote by Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for Economics. And he said about his research partner, Amos Tversky, that there were many good reasons why it was good to work in partnership with someone, but mostly it was extremely pleasant not to try to work everything out yourself. And I really appreciate this comment. So between the two of us, we've had a few students. We fed them quite a lot. And in the top right here, we've ended up in a truck in the middle of an estate in Perak for some reason. And it's always very gratifying for us to see them graduate, and so they can escape from us and go on to hopefully better things. And then finally, I would like to pay tribute to my family. So first of all, my parents, who are in this very old picture here with myself and my sister. So my mum and dad were both teachers. My father was a lecturer in chemistry in University Science Malaysia, and my mother was a music teacher. So I guess I never thought about it, but I guess it wasn't surprising that I would end up being a teacher in some ways. But they were also very responsible for many of the things that I love, like stories and reading and writing, sports, music, movies. Many of those things I got from them. And also my wife, Juanita, down here, and my son, Farhan, and my daughter, Irina, and Juanita's immediate family. So they're here today, and I've always appreciated them. They inspire me and enrich me, and most importantly, they amuse me, particularly when this sort of thing happens to us, which occasionally happens. So with that, I would like to thank Prof. April once again for her time today, special day for her as well, and not because of this though. Thank you to Harvinder for agreeing to be my MC. Big thank you to the unit Visibility, Puan Zara and Puan Dina and the rest of the team. Thank you very much for organizing this. Also thank you to the people whom I didn't name in the last 35 minutes or so, simply because of space and time. And most of all, thank you to you, the audience, for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. Jamal I-Ching Sam, for that enlightening and in-depth glimpse into your professional journey. I personally felt that your lecture helped underline that some superheroes wear laboratory white coats. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like now to call upon Yang Berusaha Professor Dr. April Camilla Roslani back again to the stage to summarize and conclude today's inaugural lecture. Prof.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy these inaugural lectures because I get to learn something new about my colleagues. You know, we're very familiar with what their professional or work-related achievements are, but through these inaugural lectures, we learn a little bit about what drives them and what their personal passions and pleasures are. So I took note that you wanted to be a filmmaker, and I think from what you have presented today, you in fact have enough material to produce a book, a documentary, and then probably a TV series and or a thriller of a movie. You know, so I'm going to be looking forward to something like that coming out from you in the coming years. Beyond that, though, I think what Professor Jamal has illustrated is how important it is to have this specialty which marries and integrates the clinical acumen, the ability to connect the dots from clinical situations with the technical expertise that's required for the diagnostics. I think also Professor Jamal embodies really the spirit of our staff in the Faculty of Medicine. You know, they are not only experts in their field, but they are really also people persons. You know, the fact that he engages so much with his students, with his colleagues, this speaks very well and bodes very well for our future as we seek to leverage into even more well-known international and global status. I think, though, to underline his journey throughout, you know, it takes special people like this when we are faced with new and perhaps unanticipated challenges, such as the outbreaks that he has spoken of today. I hope we will not have any further outbreaks to deal with in the future, but knowing the way that this world works, I'm sure it will come. And when it does, I'm very glad and very grateful that we have people like Professor Jamal in our faculty to help us deal with it. With that, please join me in thanking him for his service and also for congratulating him on his inaugural lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yang Berusaha Professor April, for chairing this lecture today. And thank you once again, Prof. Jamal, for that illuminating and enriching session. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our event for today. I hope that you had enjoyed today's lecture and gained some appreciation for medical microbiology. Thank you all for making time of your busy schedule to join us today. Once again, on behalf of the Faculty of Medicine, University of Malaya, we hope to be able to see you again at our future events. We've often heard of all good things must come to an end. On behalf of the organizing committee, this is Harvinder saying, Terima kasih, jumpa lagi.